Hi, this is Kim Hammer, pastor of Saline Baptist Church, community of Tull, with your evening devotion taken from the book of Numbers chapter 25. In order to get a better understanding of what happened in Numbers chapter 25, you got to go a few chapters back in order to see the groundwork that's laid to the events. We find that Balak had hired Balaam to try to curse the nation of Israel because Balak was feeling threatened by the presence of Israel, who was not only outnumbering him, but also outpowering him. And so Balak hired Balaam, and after 4 attempts of realizing that Balaam could not curse the nation of Israel because God was pronouncing a blessing on them, Balak backs away from that approach. And we see in Numbers chapter 25 that he utilizes a different approach in order to start to bring down the nation of Israel, God's people. Now, we find that that's a modern day principle for us today. Just because Satan doesn't win the frontal approach doesn't mean he's not going to use the back door approach or the side window approach in order to get into your spiritual house to bring you down. And that's why the Bible says that we always have to live on guard and that we cannot let our guard down because Satan seeks to devour us like a lion. And so what Balak did was that if he couldn't get God's curse upon the nation of Israel, Balak would curse the nation of Israel by bringing them away from God. And that's what happens in Numbers chapter 25. Now, when you read the first 3 verses, I'll summarize it like this. The nation of Israel was camped within close distance to the Moabites. And what we find happening was that the men began to indulge in sexual immorality, acts of sexual immorality, and that began to involve the Moabite women. And after they were seduced and after they were addicted to their sexual immorality, we find that that led them away from worshiping God, and they began to worship the false gods of the Moabites. And then as they began to worship the false gods of the Moabites, they had to feed their sexual immorality more because that's what was required of the false gods of the Moabites, until finally they renounced their allegiance to God and they placed their allegiance with these false gods that were satisfying them through sexual immorality. Now, I don't know about you, but I see a distinct pattern between what happened in the book of Numbers chapter 25 with God's nation of Israel and what's happening in America today, as people are becoming more focused on satisfying their sexual immorality and leading them away from worshiping God and what God requires of us as a nation in order to receive His blessing. I would like to make this observation, that when you read Numbers chapter 1, or chapter 25 and verse 1, you find that it specifically mentions that the men began to participate in sexually immoral activities. The responsibility was on the men, and the actions that brought the curse upon the nation of Israel were on the men, because God expects men to be leaders, and these men had failed in their leadership role. They not only failed the nation of Israel, they failed their families, they failed everyone around them. And to the men I would say this, that you are a failure if you are caught up in sexual immorality, and that is going to spill over not only onto your family, but that's going to spill over onto this nation. And so when we say, God bless America, you have to ask the question, why would God want to bless a nation that is going in the path of sexual immorality if He couldn't bless His own nation in Numbers chapter 25 because they were going in the path of sexual immorality? And God is going to draw a line with the nation of Israel, and it's going to cost some people their lives, because God will not lose the whole nation because a few choose to go that way. Eventually, God is going to say enough, and He's going to bring accountability for their actions. And that's what happened in Numbers chapter 25. The anger of the Lord arose, and as a result of it, He called for the destruction of those that had taken His nation on the path of sexual immorality in order to save the rest of the nation. What's interesting about this is He placed the responsibility on the judges to hold those men who went the pathway of sexually immorality. In the path of sexual immorality, He placed it on the judges to hold them accountable. It causes you to wonder if the judges shouldn't have been more responsible in stopping it earlier, before it finally got to the point that God said enough is enough, and it took 23,000 lives in order for them to get the message. And even in the midst of all that, there's a degree of arrogance that existed among some of the nation of Israel while all this was going on. The Bible tells us that while the people were weeping at the meeting of the tent, that there was one individual who took a Moabite woman and took her into his tent in front of his family, and it says even in front of Moses, arrogantly, as in defiance, that I don't care what you say, I don't care what God says, I'm so addicted to the sexual immorality that this is what I'm going to do. Aaron's grandson subsequently went in and took not only his life, but the Moabite woman's life as well. And they're both mentioned in the scriptures if you want to read it to find out their names. And after that, we find that the nation got the message that God is not going to condone, nor is he going to bless a nation that goes the pathway of sexual immorality. And he will hold accountable not only those who participate in it, but he will also hold accountable those that lead others astray into it, just like he held the Moabites accountable as well. There is a pattern. There's a day coming when God is going to hold this nation accountable because of the ways of which it's going in sexual immorality, just like he did the nation of Israel in Numbers chapter 25. And we'll pick up more tomorrow.